Hello, Rams, and welcome to yet another episode of Rams History. Today, we'll be talking about one of the most fascinating figures in European history, Napoleon Bonaparte, and we'll also be talking about his rise to power in France. Now, Napoleon, of course, is forever associated with France, but he was not actually born in France. He was actually born on the island of Corsica in the Mediterranean. Now, Corsica had originally been Italian, but actually in the year of Napoleon's birth, 1769, Italy, or the part of Italy that controlled Corsica, actually ceded control of that island to France. So Napoleon, who would have been known as Napoleon Buonaparte, has become known to us as Napoleon Bonaparte, much more French, if you will. Now, throughout his life, he actually spoke French as a second language, and he spoke French actually as with a very heavy Corsican accent. In fact, in his childhood, he was teased for his accent. But he will actually be a son of Corsica and really, in a sense, an adopted son of France. Now, he was trained in France. His ambition was to be a soldier. As a small boy in Corsica, he would often trade his bread for army rations. And eventually, as a young man, he was sent to France, where he was trained in several French military academies. Now, he was actually a pretty ambitious student. He tended to be a little smaller than the rest of the kids, and again, he did speak with an accent, and of course, he was Corsican, so he was treated by many of the students as something of a second-class Frenchman. But his military training did prepare him for his future as a soldier. And in fact, upon completing his education, Napoleon received a placement in the French artillery, which was something of an elite position in the army at the time. Artillerymen were sort of considered to be among the best educated in the army. It was something of an elite branch. So Napoleon will actually be an officer in the artillery at the beginning of the French Revolution. And during the Revolution, Napoleon actually became a committed Jacobin. He was a Republican, very much behind the idea of a French Republic, and he was also a supporter of Robespierre. Now, Napoleon once said that ability is nothing without opportunity, and really his life is a very good example of that. He always sort of seemed to be in the right place at the right time. Now, you may recall that Napoleon really receives his big break at the very end of the National Convention, shortly before the Directory is established. There had been a royalist uprising in Paris. The convention was at great risk, and Napoleon, with his artillery, crushes this royalist uprising with what was famously called a whiff of grape shot. As a result of that, the Directory, which was quite grateful for Napoleon's services, promoted him to brigadier general and gave him command of an army in Italy. And there he would go from there, of course, to build his fame and reputation. So if you look at Napoleon's career, he was very much in many ways a child of fortune. He always seemed to be just where he needed to be at the right moment in time. So we can just do a very quick recap of what we already know. Napoleon saves the future Directory with his whiff of grape shot. He's given a command in Italy. He then goes on to a lightning campaign in Italy, defeating the Austrians and their Italian allies. His campaigns are hugely successful. Napoleon's armies capture something like 150,000 prisoners and hundreds of cannons. They send enormous amounts of wealth back to France. Based on his success in Italy, Napoleon becomes a national hero. He then decides to lead a campaign to Egypt in the hopes of severing Britain's ties with India. Unfortunately for Napoleon, the Egyptian campaign is not as successful as he would hope, although it did achieve several things, such as discovering the Rosetta Stone. Napoleon eventually will leave his army behind in Egypt and return to France, where he will participate with several others in a coup that overthrows the Directory. This is known as the coup of 18 Brumaire. Napoleon will then outmaneuver his fellow plotters, and he will eventually name himself the first consul of France during the period that was known as the Consulate. Now, shortly after Napoleon became first consul, he writes a new constitution called the Constitution of the Year 8. This constitution essentially gives Napoleon dictatorial powers in France. Now, to validate this move, he actually has a plebiscite held, a vote, if you will. He puts this up to the voters, who overwhelmingly approve Napoleon as the essential dictator of France. What the French people really want at this point, ladies and gentlemen, is some stability. You have to recall that since 1789, France has known nothing but revolution and war. They're really looking for a return to some normalcy, if you will, and they believe that Napoleon is the man to provide this for them. So the voters of France overwhelmingly support Napoleon as he attempts to seize power in that nation. Now, once Napoleon takes power, he then proceeds to consolidate his power. And he does this through several ways. Essentially, he crushes his enemies and he makes new friends. Now, as far as his enemies go, Napoleon had quite a few. There were numerous plots against his life at this time, a number of assassination attempts. There were royalists who wanted to get rid of him. There were Jacobins who wanted to get rid of him. Napoleon had quite a few people who were essentially trying to take his place. Now, he generally dealt with this by using a very effective and ruthless secret police. They would root out plots against Napoleon and arrest the plotters. He crushes the military uprising in the Vendée. He finally brings that to a conclusion through military force. And he also took part in the very controversial arrest and murder of a Bourbon duke who had been living actually across the border in what is today Germany, a place called Baden. This was the Duke of Enghien. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. The Duke was accused of being part of a plot to assassinate Napoleon. However, the Duke was in fact innocent, and many believe that Napoleon knew this. Nevertheless, Napoleon had his troops cross the border, arrest the Duke, and bring him back to France. He was then placed on trial for being an enemy of France and for plotting against Napoleon, and he was then executed by firing squad. Now, this had a couple of effects. First of all, the main effect Napoleon was looking for was that it quieted an awful lot of opposition to him in France. It demonstrated to Napoleon's enemies that he was quite ruthless and willing to use force. And it also convinced many people in France that Napoleon could not be a royalist. After all, if he did execute a Bourbon, obviously he was no friend of the Bourbons. So this did help to tamp down an awful lot of the opposition to him within France. However, outside of France, many were horrified by this execution, and it turned many people in other countries against Napoleon. In fact, some believe it was this execution that helped to reignite the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon is, however, pretty effective at eliminating his internal opponents, and he also then begins to extend an olive branch. Napoleon really generally, at least on the surface, didn't care sort of who you were. Whether you had been a Jacobin or a royalist or what have you, Napoleon generally mattered only if you were loyal to him. He actually issues a general amnesty. He more or less tells everyone that what's happened in the past is now in the past, so we need to forget that and move on. And he actually appoints people to his government from a variety of backgrounds: former revolutionaries, former royalists, even some individuals who had held positions in government back during the reign of Louis XVI were appointed by Napoleon. So what Napoleon essentially does is he effectively says, let's let bygones be bygones, and he begins to try to establish that sense of stability that the French people are looking so hard to obtain. He also makes peace with his foreign enemies. The Austrians had been defeated in battle and they had sued for peace. And he also then negotiates a peace treaty called the Treaty of Amiens with the British. So for a brief window of time after Napoleon takes power, France will enjoy a short period of peace. Now, Napoleon also extends an olive branch to another very important institution. You might recall that back during the Revolution, the Reign of Terror had essentially led to the de-Christianization of France. The Committee of Public Safety had effectively abolished the Catholic Church. Catholic churches were torn down or converted. Many priests were executed or driven out of the country. And there was an attempt made to actually remove Christian worship with what was called a cult of reason or a cult of a supreme being. Many people in France opposed this move. They were not in favor of it. Recall that many French were loyal Roman Catholics. And Napoleon believed that it was time to sort of put this issue to rest. So he reaches out to the Pope, and together with the Pope, they sign an agreement called the Concordat of 1801. So effectively what happens here is Napoleon earns the right to name the bishops of the Catholic Church, and the state will pay the salary of the bishops and of one priest per parish. So effectively, in a sense, like the civil constitution of the clergy, church officials are now employees of the French state. All church officials were required to swear an oath of loyalty to France. The Pope was given spiritual power over the French church. He had no political power over the French church. And also the church agreed to give up any claims to property that had been confiscated during the French Revolution. Now, perhaps most importantly, Roman Catholicism was not named as the official religion of France. Napoleon did not allow that. In fact, he actually promoted religious toleration, and Protestant and Jewish French citizens were also given some protections during his reign. Napoleon also took advantage of this brief window of peace to reform France's legal code. This is really what makes Napoleon so fascinating. He wasn't just a soldier, but he delved into so many different areas, such as law and engineering and things. He really was, in many ways, a very well-rounded individual, highly intelligent. Napoleon develops a new law which becomes known as the Napoleonic Code, and actually this law is still in effect in some places around the world. This is really a uniform set of laws for France. Prior to Napoleon, French laws were sort of a hodgepodge, kind of depending on where you lived. Napoleon ends all of this. Very importantly, the gains that were given during the Revolution are upheld. So, for example, Napoleon forbids any privileges earned by birth. However, French women kind of lose out in the Code Napoleon. For example, a woman could not get rid of her property without her husband's permission, and it was actually much more difficult for a woman to obtain a divorce than it was for a man. However, this does provide a unified set of laws for France, and it also helps Napoleon by consolidating his control. Now, you might mention I mentioned assassination attempts, you may recall. Napoleon actually uses these threats of assassination to take his power a step further. He argued that if his lineage was codified by law, then people would try to stop attempting to assassinate him. So essentially what Napoleon argued is that he should become emperor. And so in 1804, Napoleon is crowned the Emperor of France. He essentially establishes the French Empire. Now, interestingly enough, the Pope attended the ceremony. However, Napoleon would not allow the Pope to place the crown on his head. Napoleon actually placed the crown on his own head. He wanted it to be clear that his power was owing to no one but himself. So as of 1804, Napoleon, the former soldier and artillery officer, is now known as the Emperor of the French, a stunning rise in power by a most remarkable individual. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you like what you saw here, again, as always, like and subscribe, and I do hope you enjoyed this episode of Rams History, and we'll see you again soon.